And welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum here at the Institute of Politics. My name is Connor Jackson. I'm a freshman at the college studying economics and government, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please take a moment to note the exits on the Park side and JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the nearest exit and congregate in the JFK Park. Also, please take a moment at this time to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Harvard undergraduate Penelope Pressman.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the JFK Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Penelope Pressman. I'm a first year at the college studying physics, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Today, we welcome you to the first in a series of events being held in recognition of America's 250th year. The theme for this evening's discussion is Union and Disunion. Drew Gilpin Faust is the president emerita of Harvard University, where she served as the 28th and first female president from 2007 to 2018. She was also the founding dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study here at Harvard. A celebrated historian of the Civil War and the American South, she is the author of 7 books, including a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and most recently published her memoir, Necessary Trouble, about coming of age amid the civil rights movement in segregated Virginia. Eddie Glaude is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, where he served as the inaugural chair of that department. His books include Democracy in Black, Begin Again, a New York Times bestseller reckoning with American democracy, and most recently, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For. Professor Glaude has examined American experience through scholarship, commentary, and activism, serving as a columnist for Time and a frequent voice on MSNBC. Pete Buttigieg made history as the 19th U.S. Secretary of Transportation under Joe Biden from 2021 to 2025, becoming the first openly gay person ever confirmed to a presidential cabinet. Before his time in Washington, he served 2 terms as mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and was a candidate for president of the United States in the 2020 election. A graduate of Harvard College and a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, he also served in Afghanistan as a naval officer. He joins us this week as a visiting fellow here at the Institute of Politics and a Hauser leader with the Center for Public Leadership. Moderating tonight's conversation is Jill Lepore, the David Woods Kemper Professor of American History at Harvard University and Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. A staff writer at The New Yorker and one of the most widely read historians in America, she has spent her career asking hard questions about who gets to tell the story of this country and why it matters. There is no better person to guide tonight's conversation about America at its 250. Now, please join me in welcoming our panelist and moderator to the stage.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, and thanks everyone for coming out this beautiful early spring evening. I'm delighted to be hosting not only this event, but this series for the IOP, where we're hoping to have challenging conversations with a whole range of people. My motto for this series is hard times need straight talk. So welcome to our first evening, which is a discussion of the forces of union and disunion that have both tested and unified the American Republic for the last 250 years. We have especially illustrious guests this evening, and one remarkable aspect of our panel is our own geographical diversity. Secretary Buttigieg hails from Indiana, Professor Glaude from Mississippi, Professor Faust from Virginia. I am from the lowly Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But I want to begin with a few maps to think about what it is in American history that has been the pictorial representation of union and disunion. These questions have animated American history, and they've generally been understood as divisions that are geographical, and so have been illustrated geographically. It's a very big country that we live in, and Europeans and Americans too frequently doubted whether it could be one country. By the 1850s, map makers were already picturing what all Americans readily understood, that the nation had become divided between slave states and free states. Even after the Civil War, this division appeared to persist, at least for moralists. By the 1880s, the census for the first time was calculated using an antecedent of the modern computer, which made it possible to see American political divisions at election time here in a color map illustrating both the popular and the electoral vote. And I want to point out how eerily similar this map might look to all of you who have studied recent electoral maps. Newspapers actually began, in a way, reifying this division when they began printing electoral result maps in the 1890s, necessitating simply using black and white, but again, largely illustrating the continuing divide between the Union and the Confederacy. That didn't work very well on black and white television, so the first time election results were projected on TV in 1952, they had to use stripes for Eisenhower's landslide victory. Color television broadcasters just used whatever colors were handy or looked like they might look good on a television screen until the 21st century, when this division of red and blue that seems, I think, almost natural and as if this is timeless to us now. But I want to actually begin by asking our panelists why it is, after Republicans and Democrats, Republicans red and Democrats blue, became our way of picturing what divides Americans, at least politically now, why that looks so similar to this map from 1888, in which Democrats are red here and Republicans are blue. Republicans were the Union Party, Democrats in the South. So I guess to begin with, I'd like to touch on some of this question of the likeness between a 19th century political map and a 21st century political map. But I actually like to start with Secretary Buttigieg, because as a freshman at Harvard, you put up an electoral map in your dorm room, I've heard, showing the red and blue state divide during the 2000 presidential election, which means I know you've thought about these maps for a really long time. So I guess I would begin asking you how you understand the legacy of that division between the Union and the Confederacy in modern American politics. Is there still a legacy, or is this just a fixation of me as a historian?
Yeah, well, first of all, let that be a lesson that anything you put on the wall of your dorm room could become a public item someday. But I remember when that map came out, this would have been, I think, the 2000 election. I think it was interesting enough that I clipped it out of that front page of the New York Times and stuck it to the wall, I guess. I think a lot of that is real, not just in the very obvious ways that so much of how we talk about certain geographies and fellow Americans divides into this red and blue, but also in the way that it's tracked geography. My understanding of this owes a lot to Colin Woodard's account of the sub-nations within the U.S. that he's described in American Character and some other books. But my experience has also been that doesn't have to be destiny, especially at a moment like this, which is so unstable, for one way to put it, that a different American political coalition might be built. I think it's telling, of course, that there was an inversion between the Republicans and the Democrats. Matter of fact, when I ran for state treasurer of Indiana in 2010, one of the very few counties that I carried was Perry County, which is in the south of Indiana. And it's really in the south of America. They speak with a southern accent there. It's on the Ohio River. And they voted for me because I was a Democrat, because they always voted Democratic, and I think they always have ever since the Civil War. That was the last time they voted Democrat, 2010. And so some of those patterns have a long tail, but I think we're living through a moment that could realign them. I was just in Northwest Georgia, the district of Marjorie Taylor Greene, campaigning for the Democratic candidate there, who, of course, faces an uphill battle, but we had 500 people turn out for that. And what that tells me is that we're actually in one of those rare moments, which for all of the pain and the pathology of being an American right now, could also be an incredibly fertile moment for different patterns, different coalitions, and perhaps a very different electoral map in the near future.
Yeah, and I want to actually put this question to you as well, President Faust, just thinking not only about your expertise, thinking about the legacy and the suffering of the Civil War, but as a kid, you marched in Selma in 1965. So we're also looking at these maps in a way at the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement and that continuing geographic division. How do you understand whether the legacy of the Union and Confederacy is part of what explains our contemporary divides?
Well, Secretary Buttigieg focused us on the future and on being optimistic about the future. I'm a historian, so I look at these maps and I think about the past. And Jill sent these maps around to us, and when I looked at them, I remembered two other maps that were very prominent in my mind. And one was a map that was made in 1861, and it was sold to benefit the suffering soldiers of the Union Army. and it was a map of the distribution of slaves in the southern states. And Lincoln used this map to figure out where he would have the biggest impact when troops moved into certain areas and emancipated those areas. Where would the biggest impact be in terms of slave population? But it shows this kind of crescent that goes from Tidewater, Virginia, down through cotton country in South Carolina and Georgia, and then off into the Mississippi Delta. And it's a very striking image to see this distribution shown in this very visual way. There's a map that an economist at Harvard named Raj Chetty has made called the Opportunity Atlas. And it's a map of the counties in which you have most opportunity to move from a poverty, as a child, a poverty level to a level of middle or higher economic substance. It is almost identical to the slave map. And when you look at statistics about well-being in the United States, whether it's maternal mortality, education levels, homicide levels, life expectancy, those areas still have far lower scores and well-being capacity than the rest of the nation. I mean, in Massachusetts, I think this is early 2020s, life expectancy 79. In your home state of Mississippi, it was around 70. I would live almost a decade longer if I just had the wit to move to Massachusetts, which I did. So to see these inequities of a slave society replicated in the work of a contemporary economist at Harvard is very chilling, I think. And it says that we have to use our history in order to get out of it. And we have to recognize that the optimism of opportunity requires certain interventions in traditional patterns and assumptions.
Professor Glaude, could you speak to this question of this sort of relationship between geographical patterns that we might see that might even map, wealth and religion and language differences, racial distribution? Should we be thinking more about this divide geographically in a smaller bore way, or are there other ways we ought to think about division and coalition?
First of all, let me just say thank you. It's a delight to be here, even though I might be in a space that I'm typically not in. No, I'm just kidding. This is it's wonderful. It's just an honor to be with you. The way in which I would attack that question is this. As I was looking at the maps, I thought of Robert Penn Warren's 1961 book, The Legacy of the Civil War. And I was thinking about the way in which the partition enables the North to think of itself as the treasury of virtue, and the South can think of itself as the great alibi, can use this way. In other words, I wanted to think about this not so much as a divide, but as a nation responsible for it. That it's not just simply slavery in the South, as if Rhode Island didn't have something to do with it, as if Massachusetts didn't have something to do with it. That map is actually indicative of the responsibility of the fledgling nation itself, right? So on the one hand, we can think of these separate regions, right? And oftentimes that leads us to overburden the South with the sins of the nation. If only they would get it right, right? That's the American dilemma on a certain level, right? But Malcolm X said, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you in the South. Right? So the maps on a certain level actually feed the myth that the moral problem resides there, as opposed to in the heart of the nation. So that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think also, just thinking at the maps, looking at them tonight, it made me think about how much we are in the shadow of the Electoral College. If there wasn't an Electoral College, there would not be red states and blue states.
Exactly.
We would not have this reified notion of the divisions of states.
Which gives outsized power to which region?
Right, right. So I want to think about some other factors then to move us away from our little geographical diversion. Thank you for indulging me. to think about these other factors: religion, race, wealth, education. And actually, Professor Glaude, I'm going to stick with you here. You've written a bit about the value gap. And I want to think about gaps for a minute. So what is the value gap? And is it getting wider? Is it a gap that can be closed that we should be thinking about closing?
Well, the value gap is this belief, and belief might not be the right word, but this belief that the color of one's skin determines the value. That is to say, that if one is white, one is valued more than if one is not white. And that valuation evidences itself in the distribution of benefit and burden. And so the value gap is going to look differently under the context of slavery than it would in the context of Barack Obama being the president of the United States or Kamala Harris being the vice president of the United States. But we will still see, right, the distribution of burden and benefit, right, predicated upon which bodies are valued more than others. And I think in our current moment, it is clear to me that the value gap still operates. It's still impacting the very ways in which the country imagines itself, and particularly the way in which the country distributes benefit and burden. There's some people who believe, and I think this goes to the heart of the tragedy of the nation, some people believe that freedom is their possession to give and to take away. And that's not just people who wear sheets or folks who are explicit racist. Justice, racial justice, is a philanthropic enterprise, a charitable gesture, something you give to me, which by definition presumes that you have more value than I do. And I want to suggest that that animates so much of our politics today, and it has animated our politics since the founding.
Are there, I guess this is a question to everyone.
Did you see her face? She said, I don't know about that.
Good, then jump in, please do.
I think that's such an interesting way of framing it because you're kind of playing on the word value there.
Absolutely.
And say more about that because you're not just calling it white supremacy.
No.
Or racism. You're putting it in a value context. Almost like what costs more, what benefits more. But also invokes, obviously, value as moral.
Exactly. I'm trying to capture it on the register of the economy, on the economic matter, that is the material relation, and I'm also trying to track the moral implication, right? Because I think Madison is right, that for democracy to function, it requires a certain kind of virtuous character. And I'm interested in what distorts that character. What has gotten in the way of us becoming the kinds of people that Lincoln imagines us to be.
But wasn't it the work of black abolitionists who constitutionalized the Declaration of Independence and its promise that all men are created equal in bringing the spirit of the Second Great Awakening to that notion of equality in the eyes of God that is also our inheritance in addition to your
I agree.
gap?
Yes. You wanted me to say more?
No, I do want everybody to say more. I could talk about this forever, but I'm going to move on just for a minute because I want to come back to this to think about other kinds of gaps. Because I know the students here, we talk all the time about generational divides and the generation gap. And Secretary Buttigieg, this is something that you've talked about a lot, that generational divide, especially as someone who entered politics relatively young. And you noted once how the victims of school shootings suffer because of the gun liberties given to older Americans. That there are burdens that the young in this country are bearing to get to your language of burden and value that I think we could think about with regard to generation as well. So I would love to hear more about how you think about the generational divide as a problem, but also what solutions you see.
Well, I think that, let's begin with the premise that a younger generation almost by definition has the most at stake, that the longer you're planning to be here, the more you will be dealing with the decisions that are being made right now. Whether you are invited into those processes or not, whether you're even old enough to vote or not, you are facing those questions. And so to the extent that there, on one hand, we'd like to believe as humans, and I feel this in a whole different way now that I'm a parent, that we're all oriented toward the well-being of a younger generation. The reality remains that there are certain choices, just simple political and resource choices, that can create tension between one generation and another. And if one generation has more of its hands on the pulleys and levers of government than others, that is likely to create a problem of what is sometimes called intergenerational justice and what any generation owes another, both the generations now living to each other, and then all of the generations now living to those that aren't here yet. But another thing on my mind as you're talking about some of these patterns and these divisions is about the idea of belonging and how we can build bigger circles of belonging that cut across any of the other divides, racial, religious, political, generational, geographic, that we experience. I actually think that even very exclusionary movements right now are actually very concerned with belonging. I would argue those in charge right now are interested in belonging, but mainly in terms of who you get to exclude. I think there's an opportunity now to seek out circles of belonging that are overlapping in character at a moment when too many of our circles of belonging have become concentric in character. In other words, we're in this moment where if I know what professional circle you belong to, or what religious denomination you belong to, or what educational patterns define you, I can probably predict something about your political affinities or other things that one marks the other in a way that's actually somewhat new, that we used to have more overlap, that if you were in a certain faith community, that didn't at all predict what your politics would be, or if you were in a certain political party, that didn't at all predict what your profession was going to be. And I think that part of why the university is such an important invention is it creates an opportunity to scramble some of those other circles of belonging with intergenerational encounter, geographic encounter, ideological diversity, and many other forms of diversity so that we can be in certain circles that cut across some of the other ones and find terms for actually learning how to deal with each other and hopefully even support one another as humans.
But isn't that also a technological challenge? Because the kinds of sort of micro-targeting that we experience that dictates what circles we have exchanges with, which is an artifact both of market research and identity politics, right? That, I am Jill Lepore, I'm a Catholic from New England, we perceive of ourselves in these categories, and we are algorithmically engaged with people in similar categories. I guess I'm fascinated by your notion that the university is a way to address that fragmentation. And this is a question I'd have for you, President Faust, about what do you think the university has done well in cultivating a sense of citizenship and belonging? Belonging has been a key word at this institution and is now a controversial word in our national politics. And what do you think the university has not done well?
Small question. I think that the vision, the promise of the university in the years in which I've been associated with universities, so we could start when I arrived at college in 1964, that sort of generation of university leadership and advance has been deeply committed to expanding belonging, understanding that it wasn't doing very well in that realm and recognizing that and then beginning to try to overcome it with changes in financial aid, with opening up opportunity for African Americans, women, all of that. I think that was an ideal. But now we're charged with failing in that in fundamental ways because of the inaccessibility financially for many people of higher education, and a divide that separates college graduates from non-college graduates as a fundamental that you could almost put on a map or a graph. And so clearly we have not achieved that. But I still think sometimes I just am blown away by the effort that the house system, I mean, you lived in the house system at Harvard, you have something like that at Princeton. We throw all these people together and tell them they're going to get along. And it's extraordinary the extent to which they do and reach out beyond anything they ever understood when they were younger and where they grew up. It's the most, I think, challenging kind of experiment of difference that I could think of in our society. But I want to add another element to this issue of separation. And Secretary Buttigieg, you talked about how you think that groups of belonging are separating themselves out more, that we have bigger challenges. I think we need to put the economic part in this question too, because as we have broader disparities in wealth, it becomes possible to install yourself in a gated community and fly your private plane and never have to deal with other people. And so I think that's a challenge that extends. I mean, universities obviously have financial issues that they need to address to make themselves more available to people at large and to make their case that they have a openness to everyone. But I think it goes so far beyond that in the ways we separate ourselves out with our wherewithal, with our ability to live lives in which we can be self-determinative and seek what means something to us. And so how do we fit that into the value part, the financial value part of the kind of value proposition that is this country?
That's a critical question, it seems to me. And it reminds me of Federalist 10. There's a sense in which Madison is really, really preoccupied with the ways in which the division between those who are property owners and those who are debtors, and the way in which a particular interest can seize power. And there's an assumption in Federalist 10 that a representational government can hold that at bay. We can't kind of attack the liberty of those of us who go out and make money and do the things that we want to do. We need to try to, in some ways, manage the effects, right? But it seems to me what Madison wasn't really imagining when those moneyed interests can capture representational government, right? When those moneyed interests can overrun the workings of democracy as such.
Citizens United.
Exactly. So the question then cuts to the root. And our vastness doesn't respond to that issue. I'm anticipating a question, I'm sorry. Our vastness doesn't respond to that issue, but you cut to the heart of one of the troublesome features of our current days, that big money has grabbed a hold of the throat of the nation.
But this is where I might, mindful that I'm with highly qualified academic experts on history and on America, put the question a little back to the three of you, that in that respect, in the sense of having these incredible concentrations of wealth related directly to the ability to concentrate power, and the fragmentation of where we get our information, which today is algorithmic, but that both of those things might be more precedented than we would think. Like, I would imagine that the way we received information, it wasn't quite as chiseled as the TikTok algorithm, but that if this was the 1840s and one of us had an abolitionist newspaper and the other one had a Democrat newspaper, maybe we weren't really getting the same news in our feed, so to speak, then either. And I certainly know from my superficial understanding of U.S. history that levels of outright control and profound corruption associated with the concentration of wealth played out in this country in the late 19th century. So as a country that got through all of that somehow, I'm not saying we resolved it, but as a country that muddled through and that went to a period of less inequality before we got to this one, can we take some kind of comfort from the fact that humanity/America seemed to discover some terms for going from a more fragmented reality to a perhaps more consistent reality in the information space, and from more concentrated wealth and power to less concentrated wealth and power in the economic and political space?
I am so tempted to give a little historical lecture here, but I am not going to do it. I am not going to do it. But I do think that it's important to recognize, yes, there are patterns, right? There's higher polarization and lower polarization, and there's higher inequality and lower inequality, and you can trace them out. And we could look at how they map onto one another very well. In fact, they do, right? The higher the income inequality in the United States, the higher the polarization, because high income inequality leads to ineffective, non-responsive politicians. So we have more polarization. But those things don't just happen, right? Inequality is reduced by progressive labor legislation, say, or Supreme Court decisions, or it is exacerbated, or more kind of media conglomeration exacerbates fragmentation. So all of these things require action, I guess, would be one point to make about the nature of the pattern, which is why I seldom find comfort in the fact that things have been bad before. Because if you look at those patterns, and maybe, just to go back to the maps, I mean, we think about the 1850s or the 1960s and think about the scale of political violence that we're looking at that is a catalyst for change, and the scale of political violence that I think we may be experiencing or anticipating. Is it necessary to kind of go through the throes of that violence for change to happen?
Could I put just a kind of pin on something you said that I thought a lot about when I was considering what we might say tonight? And you were just talking about action. And when we think about union and disunion, union doesn't just come automatically. If you think about the Constitutional Convention, they had to kind of duke it out to get the Constitution. We've had to struggle for union. And so that seems to me a through line in our whole history, that it takes commitment. It doesn't just come. And so that kind of inspiration for the future is, if we're going to get to a good place again, as you said, we've been in good places before, better places before, it's going to be because people do something and decide that union matters and that we want to be a nation that is unified. And that seems to be part of what you were just saying, and it just seems to me fundamental to all of the issues that we've been addressing.
Yeah. I mean, you wrote a beautiful op-ed last year in the New York Times on this question, calling our attention to how millions of volunteer soldiers took up arms to preserve the Union as a beacon of democracy at a time when representative government seemed to be fading from the earth. What is it that people can do today who value union? And I kind of want to get to this question is there a point at which union is not a value any longer? And I'm teeing that up for you, Professor Glaude, because I feel that you'll have something to say on it. But can you talk a little bit more, President Faust, about what it would mean to defend democracy and the Union in this political moment?
Well, the op-ed you're referring to was one that I was moved to write for Memorial Day last year, because I wrote a book about the Civil War dead, and I published it 15 years ago now, but I still think about the Civil War dead a lot. That sounds kind of weird. But having read so many letters of people who were going to go to war and sacrifice their lives, who are writing because their husbands sacrificed their lives or their children sacrificed their lives, I just was so moved to think that they did it for a notion of a nation and a union, and Lincoln's language kind of defined that purpose. And people were willing to die for that. And I just think we owe them something. We have this, and that's just one of America's wars. We owe those people something. We owe those who've come before us something, and we have to figure out how to do it. I think one place, to be frank, is the presidency, because the president is the one national figure who has a voice. I feel a huge lack of, for example, a voice that spoke about COVID and what it meant to all of us. Lincoln told us what the Civil War meant when he spoke at Gettysburg. Others have talked about loss and sacrifice and purpose in other contexts. We needed a voice to say, how do we get through COVID? And what does the loss mean to us? And what should it do to bring us together? And instead, what it's done is it has hugely fragmented us. The impact of COVID is so profound. And I think that was a leadership failure to a considerable degree. So I think leadership is one extremely important part of this. And I guess you can tell, I don't think we have the right leadership right now.
Professor Glaude, I want to put two questions to you.
Sure.
One is if you could tell us more about we being the leaders that we need and the leaders that we're looking for in response to this question of leadership. And the other is we talk a lot about the nation. We now talk about the homeland. We talk about saving democracy. We talk about the people all the time. The union is not actually a part of our political discourse. It's just what I wanted to call this panel. Does the union mean something? Should it be? Is it a term that could unify? Is it? I'm struck by the notion that Professor Faust introduced here that I think that military service and veterans is a kind of proxy for our notion of the union, right? Mm-hmm. Our notion of defenders of the union. But is it meaningful in a civilian sense? Does it, because, one could equally say about the Constitutional Convention, preserving the Union was the wrong decision. They they sanctified slavery in failing to abolish slavery. I think there are a lot of Americans who look terribly askance at that political moment and that political compromise and imagine something else might have been possible. Is union a salvageable term for us?
It can be. I don't know how it would poll. But it seems to me that if we were to explicate by elimination, what would union mean? It would take us directly to some notion of the public good. What are our obligations to each other? What's the fundamental social contract that defines our being together? And what we've witnessed over the last 50 plus years is an evisceration of any robust notion of the public good. We've become self-interested persons in pursuit of our own aims and ends in competition and rivalry with each other. That the good only animates the tribe, those to whom we think we are indebted. So an idea of the public good that is robust would give meaning to our being together. And this takes me to the first part of the question, right? What does it mean for us to imagine ourselves differently? That's not going to come from politicians. It's not going to come from prophets who are anointed from on high. We were just talking about this, Secretary. It's going to come from us understanding our role. Ella Baker, who's one of my heroes, she used to tell the SNCC organizers in the Delta, shut up and listen, you might learn something. Your task is not to lead everyday ordinary people. Your task is to create the conditions under which they can see themselves as the leaders that they need. And so I think part of what we have to understand is that the people that phrase isn't an abstraction, right? It actually is made concrete, right, in the responsibility and obligations that each of us takes, right, for this thing, for this place. Now, I stand in a very complicated relation to that. Right? We talk about the extraordinary sacrifice of the Civil War, but 50 years later, all of those black Union soldiers weren't at that reunion that Woodrow Wilson spoke at. You think about 1876, the moment in which, for the first time, the nation has an opportunity to offer a national story in the aftermath of the carnage of the Civil War. Frederick Douglass can't even get in the building. He has a ticket to be on the dais, but a Philadelphia police officer says no N-word can be on the dais. They wouldn't even let him speak. Black folk erased. Not even present. 1926. On that dais?
Let me just say, this little op-ed I wrote starts with Frederick Douglass
Right.
and his devotion to Memorial Day.
Of course.
And how important he thought it was to remember those dead. So I want to make a case for the dead again.
I got you. I'm thinking about, one of my favorite writers, of course, is Whitman and his profound reflections on the Civil War dead. But then, Whitman is lamenting the fact that we're giving the vote to these black folk who are no more important than baboons. Right? He was anti-slavery, but he was against extending citizenship to them. I'm thinking about 1926. Right? Calvin Coolidge giving his speech at that moment. Right? It's the decade of the Klan. The Klan was approved to have its convocation at the same space where the nation was celebrating its founding. 1976. It's 1976. You know what happened in Boston.
Yeah.
Right here, anti-busing protests. A young man turns around with the flag to attack a black lawyer trained at Yale. I mean, so there's this incredibly complicated relationship to this story, and the question becomes, what is the price of my belonging? Do I have to leave the particularity of who I am at the door in order for you to accept me? And it seems to me, until we grapple with that, right? I know you got something to say, Doc.
No,
Please, push me.
I'm so fascinated with this because I want what you're saying, and I'm just thinking. Jill said to me, "Okay, how do we get there?" So I said, "We need to have a better president." That was sort of the essence of what I said. I mean, one thing I said.
I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
But how do we get a better president than Calvin Coolidge?
Secretary Buttigieg.
And how do we get to the place where someone isn't valued differently because of the color of their skin? How do we get to the public good?
I do want to ask, I want to bring Secretary Buttigieg back in.
Yes.
Because I want to ask whether what you mean by belonging is what President Faust means by union and in a better version of reunion. I don't mean to harp on the term, but I also was recalling how when you were an IOP, running for IOP president, you ran on a unity ticket. Ran with a Republican out of a commitment to a notion of unity that you felt was lacking in the IOP, which I think is lacking in the IOP today as well, for all the hard work to restore that. And we might think of that as bipartisanship. But I also kind of want to put to you, because there is exactly as you say, this need for a kind of upwelling of a sense of who we are together. But a unity ticket is something that I think a lot of Americans would be thrilled to hear about in a presidential race. So I actually wanted to put it to you, would you consider a unity ticket in 2020? Having already innovated and shown your political courage in this fashion as a young Harvard student.
That's one way to do it. I mean, generally you want your ticket to have consistent political values with each other. But I'll say this. So yeah, in the time that I was in student politics at the IOP, there was a custom bordering on an unwritten rule that if you were going to run for the student presidency, your running mate would be from the opposite party. And part of the idea there, and even then, there was certainly, I wouldn't say this was a 50-50 campus, Republicans and Democrats, but it was understood that whatever differences you would have politically, the whole point of a space like this was that we would navigate and negotiate those differences with an understanding of a shared fidelity to more basic principles of the Constitution, of democracy, and of what we collectively took the flag to stand for. Mm-hmm. So if I'm trying to think about what union means, one image I would invoke is that of the flag and its utility, not just as a kind of lofty symbol, but as something that very instrumentally brought different kinds of people together. I think of the flag being on my shoulder in Afghanistan, getting into a vehicle to go outside the wire with people who, in some cases, I barely knew. And in some cases, I knew well enough to know that we had very different values and beliefs, and we were politically different, and often we were regionally, racially, economically, just as different as it gets, had very little in common with each other, but for that flag on our shoulder. And that, coupled with the fact, I would say not so much only the fact of being in danger, but maybe more generally the fact of being thrown together into doing something hard, we were prepared to trust one another with our lives. And I think you don't have to be in a scenario as dramatic as a wartime deployment for that to be true. I would say all of us are in some metaphorical version of that vehicle going outside the wire, where perhaps on the strength of nothing more than a handshake or a salute and a common flag on our shoulder, we are trusting each other with our lives. The other image I would invoke when I think about the relationship between political office and union or unity, maybe unsurprisingly given how I came up, is that of a mayor. So when you were a mayor, you live and breathe your city in all of its difference and in all of its internal challenge. And every time you walk out the door, you know that you are a walking symbol of what people have in common, even or especially for those who have very little in common other than the fact that they belong to the same city, and therefore, in some important sense, have a shared fate. And part of how you earn your paycheck as a mayor is not just to run a city administration, but to take on board the weight of being a touchstone. Because you were accountable to all of them, you were in a very real, instrumental way a reminder of what they all have in common, because they can all take it out on you and expect you to deliver for them. And you would expect, if that's true of a mayor, that is true of a president, that is true of any leader of any diverse organization. And it's why I agree with this thought that's circulating here that political leadership matters. But I think part of the job of political leadership is not to bring down the answer and give it to people. The real question is, what does a leader bring out of people? And in this sense, too, of course, we were very challenged. I don't believe in a world of good people and bad people. I believe that each of us is capable of very good and very bad things. And part of what matters about leadership is whether it calls out what is best or what is worst in us. Which is why I want to identify with your vision, Professor Glaude, of the prophetic being something that everybody's got to carry within them. But I guess the way I'd reconcile that very democratic vision of what a prophet or what a leader is, which is all of us, with the responsibility of a capital L leader, if you will, a political leader, which is to find ways to bring that out through rhetoric, through action, through good policy, and maybe more than anything else, through the story you tell that gives everybody a place, well, a means of belonging in that same story.
So with that in mind, I actually want to ask each of you as a kind of final question before we go to questions from, especially from the students. Excluding politicians and political activists, who in the United States is doing that today? Who inspires you in that prophetic, creating a sense of story and belonging?
Brian Stevenson.
Do you want to introduce for people that...
Brian Stevenson is the head of something called the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. He has been a lawyer who has tried capital cases to get unjustly convicted people off death row. And he also has started an organization that is very embedded in understanding the past for just the reasons that you described at the beginning, this question of the value of different individuals in the United States, and how until we resolve that, we can't really be the nation we want to be. And so his museum, the museums that he sponsored in Montgomery are just extraordinary. I urge you all to go see them. He's also a spellbinding speaker. You want to just follow him out the door and do whatever he suggests when you hear him speak.
Reverend Barber and Reverend Theo Harris with the Poor People's Campaign. What Reverend Barber was able to do with Moral Mondays in North Carolina, and the way in which he's trying to bridge these divides and speak to the deep inequality, how poverty has and continues to distort our democracy, and the ways in which it's bound up with a certain understanding of the nation. So those two folks come to mind.
Let me co-sign both of those, and I was thinking in terms of categories more, but similarly.
Also fine, yeah.
I think the best faith leaders are doing this. The best faith leaders are finding ways to create common terms, by reference to a very specific tradition that each of them might belong to, that some people share and some people don't, but that hopefully has a rhyme with a more moral and universal language, who understand the potential of faith not as a cudgel to beat somebody over the head or to tell them what's wrong with them, but as a call to what's better about us, and a call to belonging that can be heard across political lines. And if you think, Scripture is full of accounts where hierarchies are inverted, where tables are flipped, sometimes literally, or where categories are defied, right? People forget the Good Samaritan, for us, is just often a term that we think the two words go together, but Good Samaritan is almost a joke, or it's intended to be contradictory. The idea of a good Samaritan was kind of scandalous to those who didn't think much of Samaritans. That's why it was so provocative that this Samaritan turns out to be the Good Samaritan. And the entire sense of humor of the Bible is all these status shifts that take place, right? And I deeply admire those faith leaders, and I think they're making themselves heard in the Christian tradition, but certainly not only in the Christian tradition, whose call we would be wise to hear at a time like this.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you all so much. I would like to invite people to come up. There's 4 microphones. There's 2 on the floor here and 2 up above. And we can get started up here.
Sure.
If you could please, if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to. So my name is Amelia. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. My question is more for Secretary Buttigieg. I'm a former career Foreign Service officer, and I incidentally was your control officer in Poland quite a while ago.
Thank you.
Very good visit. But in short, I'm one of the more than 380,000 feds who have been pushed out or riffed by federal government, including the entire climate team for the State Department. And obviously, I'm happy to be here at Harvard. But my question is more, what do we do about A, protecting public service workforce? OPM's even instituting new rules this week on it. But also, how do we rescue the narrative of public service itself as a worthwhile career and something to aspire to?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wow. Well, first of all, thanks for your public service to this country. And I hope I sense from your question that you remain committed to the idea of public service as a choice-worthy life.
Absolutely.
The whole point of this place, I mean, when I was a wide-eyed undergraduate hanging out around here so much that I barely made it to class, I was imbibing the ethos of the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School that public service is a high calling. And I do worry about what this moment, this treatment of the people who, in so many different ways, serve to make this country work better, what that's going to do. A few things give me hope. One is just the fact that it remains worth doing. And so I think we can make sure that we build up the value of service, even if there's this season where people who are committed to it are being professionally brutalized by their own leadership. The other thing I would say, and I think this is especially true, maybe for those who have been involved in foreign service and international development, but I think it's true in so many places, is that your experience and your imagination is going to be needed very much for what comes next. And when I say what comes next, I emphatically don't mean just to restore everything to the way it was. If there's one thing I'm preaching right now, it's that our job as a country and the job of my political party is not to somehow take power, find all the bits and pieces of everything they smashed, remember how it used to look, tape it all back together, and serve up the world as it looked in 2022. Because that's not going to work, right? You know, and anybody who's been in these institutions, I'm thinking of USAID as maybe a particularly good example. You know that it was criminally wrong to have burned them down. And, from having worked within them, that nobody working from a clean sheet would be working to make them exactly the way they were. You know the problems as well as the capabilities of every one of our institutions. So we are about to get a clean sheet. I don't like how. We're in the middle of this festival of destruction, right, to our institutions. But that could lead to an incredibly creative period where both people who've been on the outside looking in and people who've been in the inside working it the whole time have a lot of insight to offer on how to separate the baby from the bathwater here, how to understand which things really should be restored and which things need to be designed in a very different way. Because obviously, if our government and political and social and institutional economic arrangements were working well, we wouldn't be here, right? All of that is what led in some way to all of this. So what we do next is going to require an enormous amount of imagination, informed by what came before, but not trapped in it. And I'm excited, this is not to be naive about what we're all up against, but I'm excited for what a generation of people who serve this country, especially those who serve this country abroad, could bring to the project of imagining what a new version of these institutions will have to look like, both because of how those institutions were destroyed and because of how much the world has changed in these years.
Thank you. And I'm going to go up here, but I have two quick things to say. First, please ask you to offer a very brief questions. There's a lot of questions on the floor. Also, I just really want someone to take up my suggestion and propose a Dream Unity ticket for 2028. Please, go ahead.
I'm a 1L at the law school. America's 250 years old, but a lot of the basic tenets of our history are being challenged. A lot of facts are up for debate. You have a president who openly say that he's done more for African Americans than Abraham Lincoln, and polling data will support that. His supporters will support that. What role do universities or should universities play in ensuring that the truth remains the truth and that the history of our 250-year history is actually written in the correct way?
I speak for universities, I guess. It's such an important point you've just made and such an important role for universities, but also for a lot of other institutions and for all of us. The question of truth in history is one that has to be fundamental to how we understand ourselves. I think in the last half century, we have dug into parts of our history that were suppressed, unrecognized, and it's enabled us to have a foundation for the kind of belonging, for the kind of national identity and union that we've been talking about here tonight. And so it has to be a part of what is taught in institutions like this one, and I think that includes, maybe not required, I don't want to give curricular advice to anybody, I don't have a job here anymore, but students should graduate from institutions like this knowing something about history, knowing something about civics, and having acquaintance with the truths of our past and of history more generally. But there are also a lot of other institutions like museums that are crucially important for the public history messages they send. And as you no doubt know, there was this horrible moment, and it's just one of many, when the National Park Service sent people with crowbars to take down the posters that talked about the presence of enslaved people in George Washington's presidential house in Philadelphia. Unbelievable. I mean, a crowbar, that's what's being taken to history. And we need to make sure that institutions are supported, like universities, but also thousands of other organizations across the country that present history and share it with a wider population. I'm sure you have a lot to say about this.
I think it's really important for us to understand how the 250 is going to be used. It's not just Donald Trump signing dollar bills or 24-karat gold coin. There's a story that's going to be told of the nation that rejects and refuses to embrace any talk of more perfect union. They find it insulting. So any talk of more perfect union actually calls into question this MAGA evangelical understanding of the founding, that victory was secured in the very beginning. And that's all we need to do is remember rightly. And so to tell the story of the contradictions, right, that define the nation. I mean, I don't want to invoke Chemerinsky's recent book on the Constitution. We're grappling with the contradictions in the founding document. All the compromises, the maddening compromises that have set us up right now in this moment. Right? So part of what we have to do in this moment is to challenge this certainty about the founding that secures, right, their victory as they understand it by telling the complex story of our journey to now. You know, I have this line at the end of my new book coming in May. I'll say it, where here we are after 250 years, and we're still having to deal with this shit. That opens up a different kind of conversation.
Over here, please.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you to all of you. My name is Henry. I'm a sophomore here. I know you all talked a bit about algorithmic self-sorting, and I wanted to ask the same thing, but in relation to geography. So we see a lot of conservatives moving to conservative states and cities, and a lot of more progressive individuals moving to more progressive cities and states. I want to ask, what effect is this going to have on our national discourse, the health of our democracy, and then also, you know, the strategies both political parties will use in targeting these shrinking, you know, number of House seats and Senate seats going forward?
So, look, I'm a product of very purple places. I grew up and served in St. Joseph County, Indiana, which is pretty much a 50-50 county, and I live in Grand Traverse County, Michigan, which is pretty much a 50-50 county. And it's really important, I think, for my formation, and I think there's a lot of value in practicing politics and community in places that are like that. If we have fewer places where you have that kind of sense of encounter, I think it's going to be hard on our civic life. I don't think we're destined to be locked into some of the patterns that you've observed. I mean, there's another phenomenon called empurplement, where you got some places, largely just because they're affordable, that are coming from less sparsely populated and also therefore generally redder states, that a lot of people, especially post-COVID, who figured out that they can live pretty much anywhere to do their jobs, have decided to go. And who knows how AI will scramble all of this as well in the near future. But I also think, if we just abstract from the short term to the medium term, we begin to realize that these political patterns are not as durable as you would think. In the retrospectives on Mitch McConnell's career, it was written how wildly improbable it was that any Republican could have been elected in Kentucky statewide in the 80s. I watched Indiana, where I grew up, go from being considered quite a purple state to a pretty red one. And so when you get past really even a 10-year time frame, I think these things get a lot less predictable. But there's one other thing, which is the institutional design of how we do things like elect members of the House. So state lines are what they are. But the pathology of gerrymandering is making this even more difficult, right? Because even in a place that looks purple on a map, gets sliced and diced in weird ways, so it's made up of deep blue and deep red neighboring districts. This is one of the reasons why reforms, deep reforms, some that people talk about a lot, like ranked choice voting and open primaries, others that have been floated, I think, are considered more academic, like multi-member districts, that deserve more attention. Because we've got to find ways to get ahead of that sorting that makes places even more concentrated than they would otherwise be.
Go here.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm Megan, I'm a sophomore at the college. I want to ask a pretty specific follow-up to something that President Faust mentioned about the history of accessibility at Harvard and how that's kind of an area of growth at the university. I'm wondering if you all, given your unique perspectives on Harvard, can talk a little bit about other areas of growth, especially as Harvard navigates its own very historic moment right now.
I have nothing to say.
I'm not sure what you mean by areas of growth.
Oh, sorry, you just mentioned the history of accessibility, and I think it was when we were talking about
Financial aid,
yeah.
I mean, like in the whole university, what's growing?
I wonder if you can talk about, you had mentioned that accessibility was a failure. I wonder if there are other things at the university that stands out to you.
I hope I didn't say it was a failure. I hope it would be understood that I intended it was incomplete and that we're still deeply criticized for not having done more and having percentages of students from privileged families outnumber from other families. But I'm sorry, I still don't really understand your question. Maybe Secretary Buttigieg does. Is it?
I can
I
give
take
an
it to
answer
mean-
because, well, I've been here for 25 years.
Yeah.
We don't have to.
But other things that have changed?
Yeah, I'll give you an
Lots.
example. I'll just give you an example. A lot of things have changed. But I think the first time I ever wrote to you was when you brought ROTC back on campus.
Mm-hmm.
I had been myself an ROTC student at Tufts. I didn't continue, but I had the experience as an undergraduate of having people throw things at me when I walked across campus in uniform. ROTC was kicked off of Tufts and Harvard during the Vietnam War. Also from Wellesley, all of us who were ROTC students had to go to the MIT detachment to have all of our military training. And I thought it was an act of real political courage when you welcomed ROTC back to Harvard. That was a tremendous change, and I talk to ROTC students all the time. There's a kind of active veterans group on campus now. It's a small thing by some measures, but one with dramatic consequences for students who are really striving to have the ability to both seek an education and serve the country.
And so, did you mean in terms of belonging, changes in terms of belonging, or just?
Yeah, opportunities for growth, and we talked about division and belonging, so yeah.
Well, I'd say another is in differently abled members of the community and changing our physical spaces and making that a real priority for inclusion and opportunity at Harvard. That would be another area in which I think the expansion has taken place, if that fits what you were asking about. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll go up here now. Back.
Hi. Thank you so much for your great words. First, I want to answer your question. I think Governor Westmore and you, Pete Buttigieg, would be a great ticket.
Thank you for indulging me. I just really appreciate that. This is like my March Madness.
That's what I want to win. My name's Toby. I'm a student at the Graduate School of Design. I'm interested in landscape and especially in civics. Huh. I'm interested in how civics are a democratic right and an important part of the union. I wanted to ask all three of you, As it's been decades since the Constitution's been amended, and I believe that treating it as a historical rather than a living document is in part what's hurting us today, what would your dream amendment to the Constitution be?
There's some March Madness for you.
You do know I just wrote a book about the history of amending the Constitution.
I'm in the
I'm not
wrong
allowed
school,
to throw
so
one
I don't
in.
know.
Please, no, go ahead.
I mean, you're the authority, so I want you to speak
Yes,
first.
this is your question.
I really did just publish a book that's a history of attempts to amend the Constitution. I will say that the evergreen I created this website called the Amendments Project, which is a free searchable database of every significant attempt to amend the Constitution. The reform or abolition of the Electoral College is the most frequently proposed over the course of American history. First proposed in 1803 by New Englanders to fight against the slave power. And I think it has consistently had the broadest support in the United States. And the moment when it nearly became part of the Constitution in 1969 is a story of a terrible political compromise and a moment when, it's not a moment not unlike this one, when panels got together like this and people thought about maybe we should have a new Constitution. The impetus for a wholly new Constitution to solve the political divisions that were the consequence of the Vietnam War and the kind of tumult of the civil rights movement was quite significant. I remember like McGeorge Bundy, of all people, in 1969 gave a speech calling for a new Constitution. There was just too much fundamental that had not been really reckoned with and needed to be constitutionalized. So that was a long answer, and I shouldn't give such a long answer. Does anyone else have an amendment you want to throw out?
Money in politics. Like, if it's really true, and I'm skeptical that it is, but if it's really true, at least in this current season of constitutional interpretation, that you can't tackle money in politics without a constitutional amendment, then let's do a constitutional amendment. And if it's really true that that takes a long time, in ways that you can read about richly in Professor Lepore's book, and I'll have you know I wrote a blurb for that book, which is excellent.
Touched by greatness.
So I helped. No, but really, if it takes a while to do these things, if it can take a generation, then that's all the more reason we should be underway now. Since when did we become the kinds of people where saying that something was going to take a long time and be hard was a reason to not try versus a reason to hurry up, right? So if there was one thing that I think would make a huge difference, far from the only thing, but if you got to pick one, that's where I'd start.
That's great.
One thing about that amendment, like other amendments, is an innovative idea is the so-called Sunrise Amendment, which is most Americans want to get rid of money in politics. They just don't want to get rid of it today if they like how it's advantaging their party. But you could have a constitutional amendment that overturns Citizens United that doesn't take effect until 2040 or 2060. And it would probably fly. Like there are ways to think about amendment that are not currently on the table.
There's also, this is kind of like wishing for more wishes, but can't there be an amendment to make it easier to have an amendment?
Yes, that is second only to abolishing the Electoral College and the most frequently proposed. Here we go.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here. My name is Afwa. I'm a medical student and a Master's of Public Health candidate. I wanted to ask and almost challenge the notion of unity that was discussed tonight, because I think there's this overemphasis now of, love thy neighbor, and that will lead to this, almost kumbaya epiphany in this country. And as a Black woman, that is not my reality. So I wanted to ask, what are some more tangible ways we can achieve unity in this country that don't really depend on marginalized Americans suffering the burden?
The marginalized American has to answer the
No, I'm looking along. Anyone wearing a blue suit can.
I just love the fact I described myself as marginalized.
I mean, look, from a political perspective, I think it's finding solutions that don't depend on asking marginalized people to take a back seat. And so much of what we have to do now is to compress these inequalities that we have and to lift people up. And we know the crazy thing is that there's so many policies that would at least help that about 2/3 of Americans are already on board with. and we just can't seem to get done, which points, of course, directly back to this question of our institutional and constitutional design of how those decisions get made and what actually makes the cut.
I would just widen the aperture just for a quick second. And I think at the heart of all of this, W.B. Du Bois in 1903 wrote The Souls of Black Folk. And he described this experience of double consciousness on the part of black folk, that we see ourselves through the eyes of those who despise us. I actually think that double consciousness that he described is a consequence of the double consciousness of the nation. America has a divided soul. It imagines itself at once as a beacon of freedom and as a white republic. And that division, that double consciousness has deposited, in my view, a madness at the heart of the nation that we experience in this cyclical way. And so at a certain level, we just have to choose. We don't need broad blueprints. We don't need strategies. Either you're going to be a beacon of freedom, and we can figure out what that means, or you're going to be a white republic. The folks who are in power now, they've made their choice. Let's make ours. And then that would be the basis of something much more substantive in terms of union.
That's great.
Can we come over here? Here?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for everybody for being here. And I've learned a lot. I'm from Germany. I'm a German journalist. My name is Klaus. And I have a question especially to Secretary Buttigieg, because you said something which I didn't understand very well, because it sounded a little bit abstract for me, because I'm from Germany, far away. And you said, this is a very unstable moment, but it could become a fertile moment for a different coalition. And I thought to myself, but who could join this coalition, and who could form this coalition, and who could lead this coalition? Because right now, according to what I know, is the Democratic Party is almost as unpopular as President Trump now. So who could form this coalition, and who would be part of it?
Well, first of all, I agree that just because there is less and less support for the president doesn't mean that there will be more and more support for the political party I belong to. Unless, of course, we're presenting a clearer picture of what's going to come next. That's what I mean when I keep saying that. Another way to put it is, a day will come when he no longer dominates American politics. Obviously, that day will come. And the most important question is, then what? And I actually think my party's having a hard time responding to that question, because we are so transfixed by this parade of horribles that's going on right now that all we can think about is, can we even make it to that day? Which is an incredibly important question, obviously. But I think paradoxically, the best way to have a chance of making it to that day through the political process is to have a clearer picture for people of what lies on the other side of that day if you put us in charge. Which, to my earlier point, is not put us in charge and we'll turn back the clock and make it look the way it looked a few years ago. It's not about making anything again for us. So who can be part of that coalition? Anybody who stands to benefit from a country where, to make it as concrete and simple as possible, people get paid more, everyone's vote counts the same, everyone has a chance to vote, everyone eligible, of course, has a chance to vote, where you can afford to raise a family, where one job is enough, where the policies of the state actually help you to, if you choose to, grow your family with things like paid family leave, where education at any level, from a meaningful, directly applicable technical or trade education through to the terminal degrees at the most elite universities, any way you cut it, is actually affordable, where we value each other in community and design our communities accordingly, where we're physically safe, and the last thing you're thinking about when you're dropping your kid off at school is whether they're going to be physically safe from violence. I mean, these are things that most people want, that I would argue there's a whole set of policies that command majority or supermajority support in this country that we just can't quite get enacted right now. But if we build the right coalition to make it happen, then we'll be in a situation where the party identity dissolves compared to our shared willingness to get certain things done. It has happened. that there are certain things that everybody just sort of agrees on, or that the parties fight over how to do it, not whether to do it, right? That's where we need to get to. And I think the job of politicians is to render that in a way that somebody can picture from the moment you get up in the morning and get a glass of clean, safe, drinkable water out of your tap, because we have clean water in this country, to the moment you go to bed under a roof in a home you can afford, because we have affordable housing and reasonable interest rates and financial responsibility and a whole lot of other things in this country, that your life got different. And that's the fusion I'm after between these high-minded democratic principles we have. To me, the idea of this country isn't just that we're going to be a democracy. It's that your everyday life is better because we are. And that's the kind of politics I'm trying to craft.
Okay. Just one, this sounds great. Just who could lead it?
We don't have time,
Okay,
and
sorry.
I wish that we did.
Yeah,
but I have
this was a very interesting question. Who could lead this?
We strictly must lead. This will be a discussion next time. I want to thank all of you for the wonderful questions. With apologies that we don't have time to get them all. And I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.